is going to be looking at sort of the design process. We're getting down into the weeds, really looking at this idea of the different rating systems, what is out there. We can sort of think about these in the context of the U.S. and renewed focus on urban redevelopment, urban infill. And so we'll start to, this week, go over a couple things. One will be important to look at just historically, U.S. Green Building Council. It's pretty interesting how they evolved and how they fit into everything. We'll talk a little bit more about LEED. We'll talk about sites in the ASLA initiative for rating, LEED infrastructure, Park Smart, how that sort of plays into it. And then next week, look at more of sort of this shift that started to happen around 2005, bringing in other aspects. One of them has been this Living Building Challenge and SEED Evaluator, Public Interest Design, Structure for Inclusion, the Well Building Standard, BREEAM. Where does BREEAM fit in there, sort of globally? And then lastly, how all of these things are finally starting to coalesce into a unified front, and where does the Green Building Council and Green Building certification component help sort of swirl all this around. So that will really sort of look at that shift from just environmental and ecological to sort of social, culture, and how all those things are working together. And then, so the U.S. Green Building Council, I'm going to talk briefly about them. Although green building definitely did its roots, began in Denver, Colorado, the actual Green Building Council was an effort that was begun, as you can see here, in 1993. And there were three individuals focusing on that. David Gottfried, real estate developer, Michael Italiano, environmental attorney, and then a businessman, Rick Fedrizzi. And Rick was, and this all happened in Syracuse, at least this is where these three gentlemen kind of came together and really saw the need for this kind of effort. So as the U.S. GBC continued to grow, a couple of sort of key dates that you guys should be aware of. March 2000, leadership in sort of energy, environmental design. So LEED was created. This was certainly something that went through a lot of different iterations. By 2008, that sort of marked the 15-year point. And at that point, we had 79 chapters, nearly 8,000 organizational members, volunteers, and then there was the emerging World Green Building Council. And so here, really starting to see this connectivity then between LEED and other World Green Building Council organizations. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we move into next week, because of the social and cultural focus in these World Green Building efforts. By 2014, there was then this collaboration. And so one of the things that we start to see with the Green Building Council, and we'll go into this as we talk to other ones, is that the Green Building Council becomes more than just LEED. 2008, also the LEED Green Building Rating System was launched as part of the Green Building Council. So the Green Building Council is starting, it's evolving, but by the time 2008 comes along, then what we start to see is the presence of the Green Building Council as more than just managing LEED, but it really starts to move into a whole nother arena. So I think a lot of people don't realize that the U.S. Green Building Council is so much more than just LEED. And so I think there's two things that we're going to see in this discussion today is the evolution of the Green Building Council, the evolution of LEED, and then the creation of other programs and the expansion, particularly of LEED, when we look at that idea of people, place, economics, and the sort of a quadruple bottom line that Rob Fleming talked about. So one of the big moves that we see with LEED is 2005, when LEED launches its existing buildings rating system. So 2005 really becomes an important period because a lot of other things are starting to happen that really start to focus on social, human well-being, sort of the going beyond just environment and energy savings, but looking at more regenerative aspects and restorative aspects of building. The next big thing with LEED is the movement into LEED in terms of neighborhood development. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But here what we're seeing is then that evolution, which makes sense of moving beyond just new construction into existing construction, and then more importantly, looking at LEED neighborhood development and looking at the, again, this idea of integrating principles of smart growth, urbanism, and green building. And what's interesting with that, so we're going to kind of jump over here now, is talk a little bit about it. This is going to be kind of text heavy, so we've talked a little bit about this in terms of our standards. And again, here we are, U.S. Green Building Council, who's really is becoming that way. Interestingly enough, you know, it's also administered by the Congress for New Urbanism. So there are shifts then within New Urbanists to embrace some of the components that are in LEED neighborhood development. So we are starting to see what started out as isolated events and standards starting to become more synergistic. So we're just going to go through a couple things here, before and after. Yeah, most of you, this is pretty typical in terms of the work we do as urban designers. We're going to touch on some of these components and really sort of do it more of an overview. We sort of talked about these, so we're going to skip over those. So there are two things. This idea of location and land use. For LEED to look beyond individual buildings is huge. And then this idea of multiple certification stages, because as soon as you're not a building, as soon as that's moved away, these projects have to evolve over time. As soon as you get into landscapes, that's an important aspect of what we need to be able to do. So how do you do that? How do you certify in stages? Because you just can't start off right from the get-go as LEED Gold, which is another thing that some of the other ones when we look at Living Building Challenge also has this idea of certification over time. Impossible points, we're not going to get into the points. The only thing that's tough here is, well, we'll get into that, but this idea of building dense, but keeping this, you know, so how do you have your cake and eat it too? How do you integrate nature and well-being into urban spaces? So a couple things that we start to see is this idea of building within where there is existing development, where there are goods and services, and where there is good infrastructure. And then looking at this idea of preserving sensitive lands that are in the area, I would go one step further, but again, as we'll see in other ones, is how do you fix scarred landscapes. But jobs near housing and bicycle. So where those become kind of those are key themes that we see throughout these different rating standards. I like this sort of compact, complete, and connected. People connected to place and each other, shared public spaces, and nearby goods and services. The walkability, variety of housing types and price points, farmers markets, community gardens, civic spaces, community participation in design. And so the idea of infrastructure in buildings, water use is something that we'll see on a recurring basis. A reduction in CO2 emissions, energy use, and energy has always been a pillar within LEED certification, and then solid waste. So really trying to tackle those components within sort of a community attitude. And energy, looking at the idea of green buildings, of building energy efficiency, heating and cooling, renewable energy generation, solar orientation, heat island reduction. I sort of mentioned that one. So then we're sort of looking at some of our main topics that fall within this. Construction activity pollution, we're kind of, I think, staying away from some of the ideas of how you build, although some of you may feel that that becomes a very personal, very important philosophy. Something to keep in mind. Stormwater, talked about that, water efficiency, building reuse and readaptation, recycled content in infrastructure, solid waste reduction, light pollution reduction as well. This is just a little typology to sort of take a look at. This idea of within a particular project, the importance of street tree plantings, the importance of looking at how green roofs might play into this, particularly in terms of CO2 and heat island components, and stormwater retention as well. The idea of food, orchards, vegetable gardens, townhomes, the proximity of townhomes to other buildings, children's amenities, the use of rooftops. So one thing that I think is interesting is this idea of regional priority credit. So really looking at the importance of local needs and having a regional focus. And I think that is a concept, is something that each of you can sort of think about how you want to be able to try to tackle that. I will put this PowerPoint, like the other ones, into the module for you to take a look at. But the idea of regional priority becomes really, I think, a key one as we start to look at community-centric design. So of the 9 rating system projects that serve the markets with LEED, just focusing time on neighborhood development. There's also homes, there's also commercial interiors, core and shell, new construction, schools, retail, and healthcare, and then major renovations in terms of existing buildings. So those are those key pieces. LEED does identify 7 goals. So if you want to stay at that larger, the 30,000 foot perspective that LEED has, these are their overall goals, which were reflected certainly in what we were just looking at for neighborhood development. One is to reverse the contribution to global climate change, to enhance individual human health and well-being, to protect and restore water resources, to protect and enhance and restore biodiversity and ecosystem services, to promote sustainable and regenerative material resources cycles, to build a greener economy, and to enhance social equity, environmental justice, community health, and the quality of life. So if you think about those 7 goals, are pretty much, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2, the goals that everybody has. what we're going to start to see in the weeds here is that different rating systems, different programs, different institutes prioritize these differently. So, and that's where a rating system comes in handy, because you may care about all of these things, but your building may focus, or your neighborhood design, or your community may say, you know what, this is all well and good, but I care about individual human health and well-being the most, and I care about water resources the most. And so in my rating system, I'm going to try to get the highest scores possible for those things. So as you're starting to try to think about an overall philosophy, you as a designer will also have priorities. There will be some of these that are more important. And what's difficult in this process is to say all of it's important, everything's important, but you can't do everything. You have to really be able to drill down on some key aspects of what we're trying to do. And hopefully some of those things will start to trigger and be a catalyst for other aspects of this. So that'll be something as we're kind of going through, is thinking about this and thinking about the nuances of what does human health and well-being mean? Because there's a lot of different ways that we can think about that. And it's a lot of ways that a community does. For some people in the community, human health and well-being just means I just want to be able to have food on the table for my kids at night. For other people, it might be going to the gym 3 times a week. So as a designer, where that starts to fit in will be important. So LEAD has, and these 7 identified goals have evolved over time. They were not always as human-centric as they are here. So this is, I think, a good place to be able to think about it with respect to LEAD. So then, take a look at the next one is going to be sites. And sites, these crazy little arrows that you see everywhere, there's a reason for those being there. But first, we're going to kind of go into the history on sites. I think that's a kind of a better place to start. Sites is something that began in 2005. So again, we're going to start to see a lot of things that started just getting triggered in 2005. And I've been trying to go back to see what tipping point, what event happened in 2005 that just made all these things start to happen. I haven't found that yet. So I'm going to keep looking. If any of you have a perspective on that, I'd love to hear it. So anyway, this was created by 3 entities: the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center at the University of Texas at Austin. And for those of you who don't know, Lady Bird was a pretty amazing gal. She actually is the one that started the Keep America Beautiful campaign years back. And so her concern about landscapes is pretty amazing. And then the United States Botanic Garden. And this really came out of the idea that there needed to be guidelines and performance benchmarks that could really look at the idea of sites, and that's sites with or without buildings. So that 4-year process continued on, and then in 2009, sites released the nation's first rating system for the design, construction, maintenance of sustainable landscapes with or without buildings, as I mentioned. And we're going to talk about it a little bit further. But interestingly enough, that 2015, the Green Business Certification company, so GBCI, acquired it and also manages the site's rating system. So what you're seeing is GBCI becomes this main entity that is overseeing, monitoring all of these rating systems, which is a great thing because there's just getting to be too many of them. So the fact that this is all starting to become interconnected is a really good thing. So again, we have another example in 2016, last year, where the U.S. General Services Administration adopted Sustainable Sites Initiative certification program for all of their capital construction projects. So you're seeing basically this shift of what was once the standalone certificate or certification programs or rating systems being pulled into now mainstream organizations, which is a really great thing to be able to see happening. So what are the principles? So they're a little over, they're a lot, and perhaps in some respects, I think it's a bit more complicated than maybe it needs to be. I don't know. That's my opinion, and I should not. But we'll go through them, and you guys can see what you think. Again, these are principles inform the development of specific and measurable criteria for site sustainability to be applied to land design and development process. First one, make no changes to the site that will degrade the surrounding environment. So a lot of these, I think, we'll go through these principles. They are principles. Promote sustainable design on sites where previous disturbance or development presents an opportunity to regenerate ecosystems services through sustainable design. Do no harm. Apply the precautionary principle. Be cautious in the decisions that could threaten human and environmental health. Design with nature and culture. Create and implement designs that are responsive to economic, environmental, and cultural conditions, and to the local and regional and global context. So this one becomes pretty interesting because it brings in that human element that if we think about design with nature before and Clark's thoughts, and I think we'll probably, I'm going to pull just a little excerpt from his movie just to kind of drill that point home. But we are starting to see that. Use decision-making hierarchy of preservation, conservation, and regeneration. Provide regenerative systems as intergenerational equity. Provide future generations with a sustainable environment, supported by regenerative systems and endowed with regenerative resources. So here what we see, we go back for a moment and compare in LEED. Everybody get more sick. If we look at the difference then between the LEED 7 goals, a little bit more powerful, a little bit more succinct, but we see something. We have sort of promote sustainable and regenerative material resources cycles, provide human health and well-being. So these are really then what we're starting to see is, I think, an added lens here that looks at a deeper aspect of place and people and their connection to landscape. So again, something that some of you may find is of greater importance to you than others as you try to develop your own personal philosophy towards sort of what is sustainable design and what is community engaged design really look like. So that's interesting, this idea. Preservation, conservation, and regeneration really looks at a great lens in terms of ecological sustainable places, and can be in some respects applied to landscapes and people as well. And this idea of building for the future generations, I think is a wonderful one and adds certainly an interesting lens. Support a living process, continuously reevaluate assumptions and values and adapt to demographic and environmental change. Something we're also seeing the Living Building Challenge and some of those other ones that really try to look at this idea that design and sustainability is an iterative process, and different components have to be pulled in. Use systems thinking approach, understand the value of relationships in an ecosystem. Use an approach that reflects and sustains ecosystem services, and reestablishes the integral and essential relationship between natural processes and human activity. Again, probably my perspective of too many of these. I think they should have drilled it down, but use a collective, use a collaborative and ethical approach. Maintain integrity in leadership and research. And then last, foster environmental stewardship in all aspects of land development and management. And so those are definitely, when we think about it, for sites, their guiding principles. There's similarities, and this is partly why we're sort of talking about this idea now of being in the weeds between what is goals that LEED is using. It's 7 overall goals, and then of course we start to look at its individual goals for neighborhood development versus existing buildings. So looking forward to you guys starting to really start to cull through these and pull out ones that seem to resonate more with you than others. So we mentioned this connectivity then that we're seeing between sites and LEED. And then all of these things getting pulled into the green building certification company in terms of being monitored and maintained by one group. So a couple things for moving off. Here is the lead for operations, building operations and maintenance, looking at, and this has been a huge increase for LEED in terms of coming in and LEED certifying existing buildings, which is a great one. And I think, you know, this is just a couple of great, who says an existing building can't learn new tricks? So LEED solution for existing buildings really looks at what can happen in terms of the inefficiencies in those. The best example of this is the Empire State Building. And it was completely retroed, and it's been amazing. The cost savings, energy reductions in the building has been unbelievable. And if you think about the fact that it takes up to 80 years to make up the environmental impacts from demolishing a building, how we can really start to engage it and work on this is good. A lot of the similar philosophies exist, I think, as we look at community engaged design. This LEED O&M is an important aspect because it really helps us kind of look at what do you save, what do you not save, how do you get this to work? So important aspect moving forward. A couple other things to think about moving forward in terms of LEED and its natural expansion was the site and neighborhood context. So we've really seen that. We've also seen that indoor environmental quality is important. And how can we start to look at that? However, that hasn't been that important. So the Center for Disease Control, which focus on indoor environmental quality, did an evaluation and pretty much said that there was only tertiary interest in the success of these aspects of LEED. And we'll see that a result of some of that is where the spin-off into well building and the Well Building Institute came from, looking at that. Another aspect was in an occupant survey that was done in Berkeley that looked at 65 LEED certified buildings and then 79 non-LEED buildings. they took a look at sort of some of these different factors for the overall building and specific workplaces in terms of people and their preference. And these factors include the ease of interaction, building cleanliness, the comfort of furnishing, the amount of light, building maintenance, colors, textures, workplace cleanliness, the amount of space, furniture adjustability, visual comfort, air quality, visual privacy, noise, temperature, and it goes on. And the thing that was interesting was that the results showed that occupants tend to have were only slightly more satisfied in LEED buildings for air quality and slightly more dissatisfied with the amount of light. So this becomes that sort of really interesting key point where, LEED's really working hard on the environmental side, but are they really thinking about human comfort and well-being? And again, this is where we're seeing this, and we'll talk about this next week, the Living Building Challenge, biophilic design, Living Building Challenge, to really sort of say, how well are we doing in terms of what we're giving people? And so the overall finding was that there was no significant influence of LEED certification on occupant satisfaction in consideration of the overall building and workspace ratings. And so that really is going to sort of take us into, the next arena. And I think we talk about what happened in 2005 or thereabouts. There was this shift that we were starting to do maybe a great job looking at energy, looking at LEED certification for buildings. But what about you as a person? So this whole idea of you and your relationship to your friends and family and where you work, and then the mesosystem of other affiliations, and then the exosystem of economic systems and political systems and education systems, and your overall beliefs and values and the dimensions of time. There suddenly was this aha moment, I think, that sort of said, wow, there's so much more to people in terms of how we design and what that means, and how do we start to bring that in. So that's my sort of feeling, this ecological model being applied to people and urban systems and human geography and what all those things meant has really created this shift in a lot of the rating systems that we're starting to see. And so it really talks about this idea of public places and healthy communities, and that design and architecture is now starting to, and I think hopefully as you guys look at what your philosophical approach or ideological position for community engaged design, education, and stewardship, and we'll see even more of this next week when we get into some of these other newer rating systems and certificates and approaches to design. The community, efficacy, and culture is equally as important. The ecology and landscape is important. So we see that now. LEED not only has its own new categories, but then embracing sites, and sites coming in from this idea of landscape with or without buildings. And then this idea of health and what is health, and how we really think about it. And I'm going to leave off this discussion with this slide and one more. But what I liked about this slide is that you really can affect the health of people that you serve until you go beyond the walls of your institution or profession, and even of healthcare itself. And so I think one of the most difficult things as a designer is that to reframe your mission from curing disease or creating health, and then one step further to building a healthy community, that goes from the idea of not only designing a place, but creating a place or a building, and then one step further to building a healthy environment or community that place or building is part of. And I think that's really the challenge and what we're talking about. And I think I found this a little ironic. because here landscape architecture is talking about the importance of sites and how we're healing landscape, but we're healing ourselves at the same time. And okay, so they show this brand new therapeutic garden with no people in it, as opposed to maybe showing another kind of place where, you know, that last one, you know, that's about healing people. That's not about healing landscape. This is about healing the people who live here and the landscape. So I think the design professions have to get their hands dirty and really think about this. And I'm hoping you guys will start to do that. And so I'm going to leave this with this statement, which of course is now, is hiding underneath my stuff up here. If I could get this stuff to go away. So this is a reading that we're going to be having in the nature of cities. And this quote, I love this quote, and hopefully it will really help you think about some things. The quote is, he's talking about nature in cities and how do we move forward with redesigning cities and what does that mean? And this statement is, says, part of this involves the movement devoted to the greening of cities in ways that directly affect the material environment. And this is being written by a sociologist. Green spaces, green architectural design, human scale development planning, traffic mitigation, pedestrian-friendly development, waste management, energy efficiency. Those are all things that are part of that material environment. But he goes on to say other parts have to relate to social ecology, which was that last diagram that we were looking at. Shouldn't a green outlook on urbanism include attention to the redistribution of wealth, de facto racial desegregation, extension of community board power, safeguarding of public services and education, reforms of political decision-making at city, state, and federal levels, and the like? And then he says, unless you attend to these social features, you can't fully understand the effects upon the material environment, nor can you understand the culture of cities, the folklore, the psychology of urbanism, the local human, the local humor, human loyalties, and so on, which are even less conventionally the objects of green criticism. So I think it's a great place because we'll be looking then next week and the week after into this a little bit more deeply. And I think the important part of this is, yes, you are designers and you are affecting the material environment. That is your tool with which you have. So the great challenge is, how do you deal with everything in that second paragraph? How does that become part of your ideology towards sustainable development? Because if you don't, then not much is going to change. And not much has changed. And this might be some of the reasons why. So keep that in mind, and we will continue next week.